It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that smells like coffee and old wood. I was in the living room, looking for our wedding album. The one with the faded red cover, worn from years of hands turning the same pages. I kept it on the second shelf, right between the album from our honeymoon and the one from Ben's childhood. Only this time, the shelf was empty. "Ben," I called out. "Where are the albums?" "The big ones, the ones your mother made." He appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, holding his phone like it was the solution to everything. "Oh, those? Don't worry, Dad. I digitized them." "You what?" "I scanned all the photos last week. You can see them anytime now, they're all right here." He tapped the screen, smiling proudly, as if he'd done me a favor. I stared at the empty shelf. "You mean, you moved them?" He hesitated. "Not exactly. I recycled the originals. The paper was yellowing, and we needed the space. But don't worry, I saved every image. They're in the cloud, forever." I felt my throat tighten. "You threw them out?" "Dad," he said, in that calm, patient tone kids use when they think their parents are overreacting. "It's the same pictures. Nothing's gone. This way, they're safe, no fading, no dust, no clutter." Clutter. That's what he called 35 years of life, bound in paper and glue. I walked to the shelf and ran my hand across the empty wood. The indentation where the albums had rested was still visible, like a shadow of what used to be there. I could almost feel the texture of those pages, the gloss of the photos, the little notes your mother used to write beneath each one: first snow, 1983, Ben's first baseball game, our last summer in Maine. Now, they were all gone. Reduced to data, names and dates floating in a digital graveyard. Ben held up the phone again, swiping through images that blinked and flickered under glass. "See? You can even zoom in now. But the colors were too sharp, the faces too bright. There was no warmth, no weight. Just pixels pretending to be people." I shook my head. "You can't feel a photo through a screen, Ben. You can't smell the paper, or the years." He smiled awkwardly, already looking at something else on his phone. "Come on, Dad. Nobody prints photos anymore. You're living in the past." I looked around the room, the walls where your mother's framed pictures used to hang, now bare, the neat shelves with boxes labeled "storage," the faint hum of an air purifier where laughter used to echo. Maybe I was living in the past. But standing there, staring at that empty space, I realized something that my son hadn't. He hadn't just made room on the shelves. He'd made a hole in our history. Tell me where you're watching from, and hit like if you've ever realized that in trying to save space, someone erased what truly mattered. Before everything fit into the cloud, our lives fit into those albums. I can still see your mother at the kitchen table, scissors in one hand, glue stick in the other, surrounded by piles of photographs that smelled faintly of developer and time. She'd hum to herself while arranging them, careful as a curator in a museum. Each page was a story, the kind you could hold, flip through, and live again. We started the first album the year we got married, 1982. The cover was deep red, the corners already fraying by our first anniversary. Inside, black and white shots from our tiny wedding in the backyard, friends laughing under a string of lights, your mother barefoot on the grass. She wrote a note on the first page: "Our beginning, may we never stop making pictures worth saving." And we didn't. Every few years, a new album appeared. The brown one for our cross-country road trip in '87, with a coffee stain that became part of the story. The blue one from when Ben was born, the first photo, me holding him with the expression of a man who just discovered the secret to the universe. The green one for our family vacations, full of blurry smiles, sunburns, and ice cream stains. Those albums grew with us. Every corner taped, every caption handwritten. They weren't perfect, some pages faded, a few photos warped by humidity, but they were alive. After your mother passed, I started going through them more often. It wasn't grief, not exactly, more like a quiet ritual. Every Sunday morning, I'd make coffee, sit by the window, and open one at random. Sometimes I'd laugh, sometimes I'd cry, sometimes I'd just sit there, running my hand over her handwriting. It felt like touching her again, in some small way. Ben used to tease me for it. "Dad, you're the only person I know who still has photo albums." And I'd say, "Then you're the only person I know who doesn't know where his memories live." He never understood what those pages meant. How they weren't just photos, they were proof. Proof that life happened, that we'd loved, worked, lost, and endured. Proof that our story wasn't digital, it had weight. When he was little, he used to sit on my lap while I flipped through them. "That's you," I'd say, pointing to a picture of him in a sandbox. "You wouldn't come inside until it got dark." He'd laugh, not really remembering but believing me anyway. Those albums were the first history lesson he ever had. So when I found that shelf empty, it wasn't just paper missing. It was her, it was us, it was the one thing that stayed solid while the rest of the world turned into screens and passwords. The hardest part wasn't anger. It was the quiet realization that my son thought he was doing something good. That in his mind, he'd saved me trouble, no dusting, no clutter, no yellowing pages. Just space. He called it progress. But what he didn't see was that every generation trades something sacred for convenience, and we never really get it back. My parents lost handwriting to typewriters. My son lost memory to memory cards. And I, apparently, had lost my wife's face to pixels. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the hum of his phone charger filling the silence. I opened my laptop and clicked through the digital folder he'd made, Family Archive, all years. There they were. Thousands of photos, perfect and sterile. Every smile preserved, every wrinkle erased by the brightness of a screen. I stared at one picture, your mother, sitting on that same couch, holding Ben when he was a baby. The real photo had a crease running through her cheek from where I'd folded it once to keep in my wallet. I'd touched that crease every time I missed her. On the screen, the crease was gone. Her face was flawless, and somehow, completely lifeless. That was the moment I understood, technology had copied the image but erased the soul. And so, I decided that if memory couldn't be stored, it had to be rebuilt. It was late that night when I realized I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Ben's words, "They're all in the cloud now." The cloud. A word that meant nothing and everything. A word as weightless as what I'd lost. I got up, poured myself a glass of water, and walked back to the shelf. Empty still. The faint rectangle of dust outlined where the albums had been, 5 in all, stacked by decades like chapters of a life. I ran my hand across it, tracing the outlines in silence. For the first time, I didn't just feel sad, I felt hollow. It wasn't about the photos. It was about the touch. The crackle of the page, the weight of a memory you could actually hold. That small act of turning a page, it was how I measured time. So I went to the desk, pulled out a notebook, and wrote on the first line. Album 1, the beginning. I started listing every image I could remember. The wedding, the way your mother laughed when the cake nearly tipped over. The first apartment, beige walls, a leaky faucet, and a couch that smelled of second-hand dreams. Our first car, a beat-up Chevy that stalled more often than it ran. At first, the details came slowly, but soon they poured out. Each line became a photo in my head. I wrote until the sun crept through the blinds, until the paper was covered with names, colors, and moments I'd thought I'd forgotten. The next day, I went to a local print shop and asked if they still developed photos from negatives. The kid behind the counter looked at me like I'd asked for a telegram. "We don't do that anymore," he said. "But we can print from digital files." I smiled sadly. "That's the problem, son. I don't have files. I have memories." So I bought an empty scrapbook instead. Thick pages, leather cover, the kind that smelled faintly of glue and time. At home, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where your mother had once glued her photos, and began to draw the ones I remembered. I sketched the outlines, wrote captions underneath, sometimes added small details. Margaret's hair smelled of lilacs that day, or Ben's first tooth, he cried, then laughed. Each page was half art, half resurrection. I wasn't just recreating photos. I was reclaiming them. One memory at a time. When Ben came by that weekend, he found me sitting at the table surrounded by pens, old envelopes, and scraps of brown paper. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked, half amused. "Making an album," I said. He frowned. "But you already have them, on the phone." I looked up at him. "No, Ben. You have pictures. I have a life. And I'm not ready to let it live in your pocket." He sighed, shook his head, and muttered something about nostalgia. But I saw the flicker of something else in his eyes, doubt, maybe even shame. After he left, I turned another page. Drew your mother's smile from memory. Not perfect, but close enough to feel true. That's when it hit me, I wasn't just rebuilding an album. I was rebuilding the bridge between remembering and feeling. And maybe, just maybe, that bridge could carry others too. For weeks, I kept working on that album. Each evening, after dinner, I'd sit at the table with a pot of tea, the house wrapped in the kind of silence that lets you hear your own heartbeat. I wasn't trying to make something beautiful, I was trying to make something real. Some nights, I'd draw from memory. Other nights, I'd write instead, short descriptions of moments I could still see if I closed my eyes long enough. Ben chasing fireflies behind the house, 1994. Margaret reading on the porch, hair caught in the sunset. Our last trip to the lake, the sky pink, her hand warm in mine. The pages began to fill with these fragments of life, messy and uneven, but alive. Each line carried the weight of a photograph that no longer existed. But the more pages I filled, the heavier something else grew, a quiet anger. Because I wasn't just rebuilding memories. I was rebuilding what my son's world had erased, the part of living that wasn't polished or optimized, the part that left fingerprints on everything it touched. One evening, I stopped by the library to return a book. The librarian, a kind woman named Joan, noticed the notebook under my arm. "That looks well loved," she said with a smile. "It's my new photo album," I told her. She laughed softly. "That's a first. People usually just show me things on their phones." "Phones can't hold this kind of thing," I said. "Not the smudges. Not the handwriting. Not the stories behind them." She leaned forward, curious. "Can I see?" I hesitated but opened it. She turned each page slowly, tracing her finger over the sketches, the captions, the bits of tape and coffee stains. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "You know," she said, "this isn't just a scrapbook. It's history. You should show people." "Show people?" I repeated, half laughing. "Yes," she said, smiling. "You'd be surprised how many folks have lost their photos. Fires, floods, old phones dying. Something like this might remind them what memory feels like." That idea stayed with me all night. The next morning, I called her. "What if we did something together?" I said. "An exhibit, but not of pictures. Of what's missing." Joan loved it immediately. We decided to call it, Photos That No Longer Exist. The library cleared a small space by the entrance. I made flyers by hand, photocopied them, and posted them around town. Lost a photo? Bring your story. We're rebuilding memory, one page at a time. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few curious retirees. Maybe nobody. But the first evening, people came. A man brought an old camera with no film, saying it had once held the last picture of his parents. A woman brought a single shoebox of torn envelopes, each with a date scrawled in pencil, all that was left after a house fire. A teenager showed me a cracked phone she couldn't unlock anymore. "All my pictures are in there," she said, voice trembling. We sat together, told stories, and wrote them down. I gave them blank pages and pens. Some drew, some described, some just talked while I wrote for them. We hung the pages on strings across the room, and slowly, the space began to look like a living photograph, memory stitched together from fragments. Ben came by halfway through the week. He stood in the doorway, watching a group of strangers flipping through the hanging pages. He didn't say much at first, just looked around, taking it all in. "What is this?" he finally asked. "It's an album," I said. "One that can't be deleted." He frowned, glancing at the crowd. "You really got all these people to bring stories?" "I didn't get them to," I said. "They already had them. They just needed permission to remember." He nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something he'd never noticed before. When the library closed that night, Joan looked at me and said, "You didn't just start an exhibit, you started a movement." I smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe we just reminded people that the past isn't gone, it's waiting to be retold. And as I packed up my notebook, I realized that for the first time in years, I didn't feel angry anymore. Because somewhere between those hanging pages, my own memories had found a home again, not on a shelf, not on a screen, but in the hearts of people who understood what loss really meant. The exhibition was supposed to last a weekend. It ended up lasting the whole month. At first, it was just locals, people bringing their scraps of life in paper bags or shoeboxes. But soon, word spread. A high school art teacher brought her students, then the local paper wrote a small article titled, "The Town That Remembers Together." The next week, a reporter from Richmond came to do a story. After that, the library couldn't hold everyone. The walls filled up, not with photographs, but with stories written in every kind of hand imaginable. Some neat and deliberate, others shaky or childlike. Beside them hung sketches, printouts of old emails, and even photocopies of lost photographs someone had found online. It was messy, imperfect, human. Joan and I started calling it a living archive. Each new visitor added something, a fragment, a date, a detail. A woman wrote, "My mother's laugh sounded like the crackle of vinyl." A boy added, "Dad never took pictures, but I remember his smell, like sawdust and coffee." I'd walk through the room every day and see people crying, smiling, holding each other's stories like fragile glass. It hit me that this shared remembering, was more powerful than any hard drive. And that's when the idea came. One evening, while closing up, I told Joan, "What if we make this bigger? Not just here, everywhere. People don't lose memories because of age or fire anymore. They lose them because they think they've saved them in a place they'll never visit again." She looked up from her desk. "You mean, like a traveling show?" "Exactly. A traveling archive. We collect stories and rebuild the past one town at a time." She grinned. "I think that's the best idea I've heard in 20 years. So we started small, we created a simple site, not to store anything but to invite people. No logins, no uploads, no filters, just a form that said, 'Tell us about a photo that no longer exists.' And they came. Hundreds of stories from across the country, people writing about family, war, weddings, hurricanes, lost phones, broken computers. One man wrote about how his grandmother's only photo was destroyed in a flood, but he could still draw her face by heart. I printed every single story and added them to binders, old-fashioned, 3-ring binders. We started mailing copies to other libraries that wanted to host their own memory nights. By the second month, we'd filled 4 binders and a wall of letters. It wasn't just nostalgia anymore. It was resistance, a quiet rebellion against a culture that measures memory in gigabytes instead of grace. Ben came back the day a TV crew arrived to film the exhibit. I saw him before he saw me, standing near the door, watching as people flipped through pages strung up like laundry lines of memory. When our eyes met, he smiled awkwardly. Didn't think this would turn into such a big thing. Neither did I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. He looked around, slower this time, really seeing it. They're writing their own history, he murmured. Exactly, I said. That's what I was trying to tell you, Ben. Memory isn't stored, it's passed on. He looked at me, thoughtful. You know, I showed your story to my co-workers, about the albums. Half of them said they haven't printed a single photo in years. One guy said he didn't even know where his pictures were, just somewhere online, he guessed. Then they're already half forgotten, I said. He didn't argue. Instead, he walked toward one of the strings and began reading the notes. After a while, he picked up a pen and a blank page from the supply table. He stood there for a long moment, thinking, then wrote something down and clipped it among the others. I didn't ask what he wrote, some things you have to let speak for themselves. That night, after the crowd left, I walked by and found his note. It said, Photo, 1997, Dad holding Mom's hand at the county fair. I didn't remember her smile until now. The handwriting was firm but trembling. I stood there for a long time, my eyes blurring. For years, I thought I'd been trying to save the past. But in that moment, I realized what I was really doing, giving my son away to see it again. A week later, he brought over a box. I went to the thrift store, he said, smiling. Found these for you. Inside were 10 empty photo albums, all shapes and sizes. I thought maybe we could start filling them again, he said. I nodded slowly. Not just for us, I said. For everyone who still remembers how to hold a moment. He grinned. Then we'd better buy more glue. We both laughed, and in that sound, I heard the past settling back into place, page by page. By the time fall came around, the photos that no longer exhibit had become something bigger than any of us imagined. It wasn't just a library project anymore, it was a pilgrimage. People came from neighboring towns, even out of state. They didn't just look at the walls, they added to them. Every week, Joan and I would string up new sheets of paper, until the entire room looked like a living quilt of stories. One Saturday morning, I arrived early to open up. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust, the good kind of dust, the kind that holds whispers of 1,000 hands. As I unlocked the door, I saw Ben waiting on the steps, holding a small, square box. Morning, I said cautiously. He looked different, tired, but in a settled way. Morning, he replied. I brought something. We walked inside. The light slanted through the windows, catching the handwriting that covered the walls. I could tell he was overwhelmed again, the same quiet awe I'd seen before, but deeper this time. He looked at the papers like he was walking through a church. I wanted to give you this, he said finally, placing the box on the table. I opened it. Inside was a neatly bound photo book, black leather cover, gold lettering that read, The Carter Family, Reconstructed. I used the files I saved, he said quickly, but I printed every one. I even retyped Mom's captions. Had to guess at some of the handwriting, but I did my best. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My fingers traced the edge of the cover. The texture was smooth and new, not quite right, but when I opened it, something inside me broke softly. There we were, Margaret and me on our wedding day, sunburned and glowing, Ben as a toddler, grinning with 2 missing teeth, the family trip to Maine, the one I thought he'd forgotten. Every image carefully printed, every page deliberate. And at the very end, on the last page, a note written in Ben's hand. For Dad. I thought I'd saved your memories. Now I understand you were saving mine. My throat tightened. I looked up at him. He was watching me closely, nervous. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. I thought I was protecting everything. Making sure it wouldn't get lost." I closed the book gently. "You didn't mean to erase it, either." "But you did. You can't back up a lifetime, Ben. You can only live it." He nodded, eyes wet. "I know that now." We stood there in silence. Around us, the room buzzed faintly with life, paper rustling, voices from the next room, the whisper of air conditioning. Then Ben asked, "What are you going to do with all this, Dad?" "The stories, the letters." I smiled. "Keep them safe, of course. The old way, ink and paper. So the next time someone forgets that memories need space, there'll be proof." He chuckled softly. "And here I thought I was the one teaching you about storage." I laughed, the first real laugh between us in months. "You did, son. You just forgot that hearts don't come with cloud backups." He sat down at the table, opened one of the community binders, and began flipping through the handwritten notes. Every so often, he'd stop to read one out loud. "My husband's old Polaroids used to smell like cinnamon gum," he read, smiling. "People actually remember smells." "That's the part the phone can't keep," I said. He nodded thoughtfully, then looked up. "Dad, could we add Mom's photos to this? Maybe call it a family wall or something? For everyone who's lost someone." I looked at him, and something inside me, something hard and heavy, finally loosened. "Yes," I said softly. "We can." So we did. We made a section near the entrance, framed in reclaimed wood. At the top, Ben carved the words by hand. "Memory isn't stored, it's passed on." When the first visitors came through and saw it, they stopped. Some cried. Some smiled. Most just stood there quietly, taking it in. And that day, as father and son stood side by side beneath those words, I knew this wasn't about photos anymore. It was about forgiveness, about how sometimes, losing something together can bring you closer than keeping it ever did. Before we closed that evening, Ben turned to me. "You know, Dad," he said, "maybe the reason we take pictures isn't to remember, but to have something to return to." I looked at him, proud and a little heartbroken. Then I guess we finally came home. After that day at the library, something shifted, not just between Ben and me, but in the air around us. He started stopping by more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with his wife and their little boy, Ethan. At first, it was just to check in on the project, but I could tell it was something else. He was looking for something he'd lost, something that couldn't be coded, compressed, or uploaded. One Saturday morning, he showed up with Ethan in his arms and a camera slung around his shoulder. Not a phone. A real camera, the kind with weight. "Picked this up at a pawn shop," he said, setting it on the table. "Figured I'd try doing things the old way." I smiled, pouring him coffee. "Careful. That old way tends to stick." He grinned. "Yeah, well, maybe that's the point." Over the next few weeks, I started seeing his photos, printed, framed, clipped to a string in his living room. Real ones. Some were crooked, some too dark, others slightly blurred. But they had life. You could feel the day in them, the air, the laughter, the noise behind the smile. Ethan with chocolate on his face. His wife dancing barefoot in the kitchen. Ben himself, looking right into the lens, sunlight on his face. One afternoon, he handed me a small stack of them. "For you," he said. "You can't hang data on the wall." I held the prints, still warm from the machine, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Your mother would have liked these," I said finally. "She always said the best photos were the ones you could feel breathing." He smiled softly. I think I finally get what she meant. The exhibit continued growing long after the reporters left. Joan and I turned it into a permanent feature, new stories still coming in by mail every week. People began sending in reprinted photos, rebuilt from memory, drawn or described by hand. We even got one from a family in Alaska, a child's crayon drawing of his dog that had passed, with the note, "Mom says this counts as a picture." It did. Everyone did. Ben began helping with the project too. He designed posters, by hand this time, and ran community print days where people brought their phone pictures and left with something they could actually hold. He never called it marketing or branding. He just called it doing right by memory. One day, while we were hanging a new display, he turned to me and said, "You know, Dad, I used to think the point of progress was to make life lighter. Now I think we made it so light, we forgot to hold on." I looked at him, older now, wiser in ways you only get by losing something first. "Progress isn't bad," I said. "But sometimes, we mistake deleting for improving." He nodded slowly. "I won't make that mistake again." That Christmas, he brought me a gift. It was a photo album, not new, but restored. The same kind your mother used to make. The cover was dark blue with gold corners, the first page filled already. It was a picture of me, holding Ethan on my lap, both of us laughing. Underneath, in Ben's handwriting, was the caption. "Grandpa teaching Ethan how to hold a photo without smudging the corners." I ran my fingers over the words, and my eyes stung. "Looks like you're keeping the family tradition alive," I said. "Not just keeping it," he replied. "Passing it on." He said it so simply, but those words carried the quiet power of understanding, the kind you can't download or fake. That night, after they left, I sat by the fireplace and opened the album again. Page by page, life unfolded, small moments caught in the act of being real. The laughter wasn't digital, the paper wasn't perfect, and the ink smudged slightly where Ben had written too fast. But every flaw felt sacred. I thought about the empty shelf from that first day, the one that had felt like a grave. Now it was full again. Not the same albums, no, those were gone forever. But something stronger had taken their place. Not just photos. Legacy. And as I turned the last page, I realized that my son hadn't just learned how to take pictures again. He'd learned how to see, really see, the life he was living. It was early spring when Ben came over with a wide grin and a box tucked under his arm. "Dad," he said, setting it on the table, "I think it's time we make one together." Inside was a blank album, thick ivory pages, leather cover, and a single gold-embossed word on the front, Legacy. He handed me a pen. "You start," he said. So I did. On the first page, I wrote in my careful, uneven handwriting. "For those who still believe memory belongs in hands, not hard drives." Ben smiled. Then we began filling it, not chronologically, not by theme, just by feeling. A photo of Margaret laughing with cake on her cheek. Ethan's first day of kindergarten, still wrinkled from his pocket. A snapshot of Ben and me at the library, the wall of memories behind us. Each page carried something living, glue smudges, ink streaks, fingerprints pressed faintly into the corners. We left space between the photos, too, on purpose. "For the ones we haven't taken yet," Ben said. When we finished, he closed the album and placed his hand over mine. "You were right, Dad. Photos don't keep people alive. People do." I looked at him, at the man who once threw away my life to make room for his own, and felt nothing but pride. "And now you'll do the same for Ethan," I said. He nodded. "Already started. He's got his own little camera. Keeps taking pictures of his sneakers." I laughed. Every story starts somewhere. We sat there in the quiet, flipping through the pages again, letting the sound of paper fill the room. It wasn't just an album anymore. It was a bridge, between generations, between remembering and being remembered. When we finished, Ben reached for a marker and drew one last thing on the cover, two hands, one older, one smaller, turning a page together. He looked at me. So we don't forget who held it first. I smiled, my throat tight. Good thinking, son. That night, after he and Ethan left, I placed the album on the same shelf where the old ones used to be. The space that once felt like a loss now glowed like a promise. And for the first time in years, I didn't worry about what would happen when the photos faded. Because the stories wouldn't. They were safe, not in a cloud, but in the hearts of those who'd learned to hold them.